Right. Thanks everybody for coming in and having a listen to me. And I have put together this presentation using a material from an article written by a girl called Frances Frey and Anne Morris, and it was published in the Harvard Business Review. Now, Frances Frey is an American academic. She's a UPS Foundation Professor of Service Management, a Senior Associate Dean for Executive Education at the Harvard Business School. She's the Senior Vice President for Leadership and Strategy at Uber. And Anne Morris is a spouse and MD of the Concise Leadership Institute. So a real pair of underachievers that put this whole lot together. But in spring 2017, Frey and Morris were approached by a lady called Megan Joyce, who was at the time the general manager for the USA and Canada for Uber. And she was hoping for them to provide some healing after a long string of pretty deep and self-inflicted wounds, because Frey and Morris had a track record for being able to help organizations to tackle some pretty messy leadership and cultural challenges. And Uber had been astonishingly disruptive and successful up to the point, but it also appeared to be more, its success appeared to be more and more associated with sort of the abandonment of basic decency. You know, when the taxi services went on strike in New York to protest against a Trump travel ban, Uber was seen to have profiteered from the situation. And that led to widespread rage and this whole #DeleteUber campaign. About a month after that, an engineer called Susan Fowler blogged about her experience of discrimination, harassment in the company, causing more outrage. And if that wasn't enough, the MD at the time, Travis Kalanick, was seen in an interaction with an Uber driver, being completely dismissive of the challenges and needs faced by them. And these and other incidents quickly led Uber to gain a reputation as a really cold-blooded behemoth, which would stop at nothing to win. And so Frey and Morris really debated quite hard as to whether they really wanted to take on that project, because the workforce was frustrated, the brand was well on its way to becoming toxic, but they eventually decided that yes, it was a project worth doing, because if they could turn this around, they would probably have a really good roadmap to turning around other companies who had lost their way. And so they did it. And they started with this concept of trust. So we think of trust as precious, and yet it's the basis for almost everything that we do. You know, trust is the reason we're willing to exchange our hard-earned pay for goods and services, pledge our lives to another person in marriage, or even vote to have somebody represent us in government. So we rely on laws and contracts as these kind of safety nets, but even those are ultimately built on our trust in the institutions that enforce them. We don't know that justice will be served if something goes wrong, but we have enough faith in the system that we're willing to make pretty high stakes bets with relative strangers. Trust is also one of the essential forms of capital a leader has. But building trust often requires thinking about leadership from a whole new perspective. The traditional leadership narrative has been all about you, your vision, your strategy, your ability to make tough calls, rally the troops, talents, charisma, heroic moments of courage and instinct. But leadership isn't really about you or me, and it is about empowering the people around us as a result of our presence, about making sure that the impact of our leadership continues in our absence. And that's the fundamental principle in the course of a career of making leaders and organizations better. Your job as a leader is to create the conditions for your people to fully realize their own capacity and power. And that's true not only when you're in the trenches with them, but also when you're not around. And even more so, and this is the keenest test, after you've permanently moved on from that team or organization. And that is the essence of empowerment leadership. The more trust you build, the more it is possible to exercise that type of leadership. So what drives trust? How do you build up the stores of this foundational leadership capital? You know, trust has three core drivers: authenticity, logic, empathy. People tend to trust you when they believe that they are interacting with the genuine version of you. That's the authenticity part. When they have faith in your judgment and your competence, that's the logic part. But also when they feel that you care about them, and that's the empathy part. And when trust is lost, it can almost always be traced back to a breakdown in one of these three key drivers. Now, people don't always realize how the information, or more often the misinformation that they're broadcasting, may undermine their own trustworthiness. And what's worse, things like stress tend to amplify the problem, causing people to double down on the very behaviors that are making others skeptical of them. For example, if you are unconsciously masking your true self in a job interview, you might find that that's the very behavior that's leading the people interviewing you not to trust you, because it's less than fully authentic. But the good news about this is most of us generate a stable pattern of trust signals, which means a small change in behavior can go a pretty long way to getting us a lot better out there. So in moments when trust is broken or fails to get any traction, it usually comes down to the same driver that has gone kind of wobbly on us. And it could be authenticity, empathy, or logic. And they call that your trust wobble. In simple terms, it's the driver that is the most likely to fail you. And everybody, it turns out, has a wobble. You've just got to figure out what yours is. So to identify the wobble, think about a recent moment when you were not trusted as much as you wanted to be. Maybe you lost an important sale, maybe you didn't get an assignment that you wanted, maybe somebody simply doubted your ability to execute. With that moment in mind, you need to do something quite hard. You have to give the other person in that story the benefit of the doubt. Assume that they were right, and let's call that person your skeptic. So assume your skeptic's reservations were valid and that you were the one responsible for the breakdown in trust. Now, this exercise only, of course, works if you own it. But if you had to choose from our three trust drivers, which would you say went wobbly on you in that situation? Did your skeptic feel that you were misrepresenting some part of yourself or your story? If so, then it might be an authenticity problem. Did your skeptic feel that you might be putting yourself in front of them or your own interests? That could be an empathy problem. Or did they question the rigor of your analysis, the ability to execute on an ambitious plan or something like that? Because that would be a logic problem. So withholding your true self puts a cap on your ability to lead or sell. So to stand back and try and look at your pattern of wobbles across multiple incidents, pick 3 or 4 of them, which one comes up the most? What does your typical wobble seem to be? Does the pattern change under stress? Because you might find that you wobble on one trait if you're talking to the people who you're leading, and you might wobble on another trait if you are talking to the people who are leading you. That's not uncommon. So if you can bring somebody along who knows you well, along for your diagnostic ride, ideally somebody who knows you, sharing your analysis can be clarifying, perhaps even liberating. It'll help you test and refine your hypothesis. And if you can do that, it's really, really helpful, because about 20% of self-assessments need a round of revision. So choosing a partner can help keep you honest. And then you can go back and test your analysis directly by speaking openly about it with your skeptic. This conversation alone can be a really powerful way to rebuild trust. When you take responsibility for a wobble, if you like, you reveal your humanity, that's your authenticity. You reveal that you have an analytic nature, that's your logic, and while communicating your commitment to the relationship. So it's a really good way to build trust, making yourself a little bit vulnerable. Now, Going through them one at a time. Empathy. Most high-achieving leaders struggle with this one. Signaling a lack of empathy is a major barrier to empowerment leadership, rather. If people think you care more about yourself than you care about them, they're not going to trust you enough to lead them. When it comes to selling, if they feel that you're in it to make a quick buck or to make the sale rather than solve their problem, again, this is always going to become a commoditization of the transaction at best, so it becomes about price, or else the sale collapses. So empathy wobbles are common among people who are analytical, driven to learn, often get impatient with those who aren't similarly motivated or take longer than they do to understand something. And additionally, the tools and experience of the modern working place continually distract us from what we're doing. 24-hour demands on our time, putting at our disposal all these kind of technologies and wizardry that compete for our attention at any given time. And all of those beeping and buzzing devices constantly alert our self-importance, sometimes smack in the middle of an interaction with the very people that we're working to try and empower or sell to. So empathy wobblers pay attention to their close behavior in group settings to work it out, particularly when other people might have the floor. Consider what happens, when you go on networking meetings. When it kicks off, everybody's very engaged, but as soon as the empathy wobblers, if you like, understand the concepts under discussion and have contributed their ideas, their engagement just plummets straight away, and they begin to make sort of ostentatious signs of boredom, start checking their devices, multitasking, anything to make clear that this meeting is now beneath them. And unfortunately, the cost of those sort of indulgences is trust. So if you signal that you're mattering more in the room than everybody else, then why would anybody trust the direction that you're going in, what it's in for the rest to come along? So there's a basic solution to that problem. Instead of focusing on what we need to do in a meeting or put ourselves across, to work to ensure that everybody else gets what they need. Take radical responsibility for others in the room. Share the burden of moving any dialogue forward, any discussion forward, whether or not it's within your own interest or even in your bailiwick. Search for the resonant examples that will bring concepts to light, and don't disengage with everybody else in the room once you've said your piece. And this is something that is almost impossible to do if you're texting, checking emails, looking at stuff, writing things down. Everybody knows that when you're looking at your phone, you're not actually taking notes about their good ideas. And the last thing to say on empathy is this: if you do nothing else to change your behavior, put away the phone more frequently. Put it away, out of sight, out of reach, not just flipped over for a few minutes, and you'll be amazed at the change of the quality of the interactions that you begin to have with people and your ability to build trust with them. Now onto the logic. If people don't always have confidence in the rigor of your ideas, or they don't have full faith in your ability to deliver on them, then probably logic is the wobble here. If they don't trust your judgment, then why would they want you at the wheel? Why would they trust that your solution is the right one for them? So when logic is the problem, we advise going back to the data, the root cause. You're making sound evidence, speak about things you know to be true beyond a reasonable doubt, and then this is the hard part, is to stop there. One reason, a guy called Larry Bird, he was a basketball player with a team called the Boston Celtics, and he was so incredibly good because he would only ever take the shots that he knew he could reliably make. And that was the choice that made him completely different between him and the other basketball players, because other basketball players would always let ego, adrenaline, appearance of opportunity that could be missed influence them in their shots, and he would never ever shoot unless he knew 100% in his own mind that he was going to make that shot. And as a result, he was the highest point scorer in the entire league. Now, the business version of that is a guy you might have heard of called Warren Buffett. You know, he does the same thing. He uses a baseball analogy. He says, I only swing at the really slow balls that have come past me at navel height. In other words, he would let 100 profitable opportunities pass without doing anything, just to make sure that one really obvious and easy one he could smash completely out of the park. So if logic is your wobble, it's to take those examples and learn to play within ourselves, understand where our competence lies. And once you get comfortable with how that feels, start expanding what we know. Make an effort to learn from other people, because their insight is among our most valuable resources. But to access it, you must be willing to reveal that you don't have all the answers, something leaders often resist. Engaging people about their experiences, also the additional benefit of communicating what you are and what energizes you professionally, and that's authenticity as well. So for most logic wobblers, rigor is not really the issue. Much of the time, the problem is the perception of it rather than the reality of it. But why does this happen? Well, that's often because they're not communicating their ideas effectively. There's generally two ways to communicate complex thoughts. The first way is to take your audience on a journey, a bit like an author does. The world's best storytellers use this. It's like a funnel. You take a meandering pathway down towards a single point at the end. But if logic is a wobble, this might be a risky kind of way of communicating, because all of that circuitous journeying, you're likely to lose your audience somewhere along the way. And they may even abandon you somewhere along that. So in order to avoid that, what you can do is turn that funnel upside down and start communicating the key point first, and then taking your audience out to the logic behind it afterwards. Finally, authenticity. Now, if people feel that they haven't got access to the real you, to complete full account of what you know, think, feel, then you've probably got an authenticity wobble. So a quick test of that is, how different is your professional persona from the persona you have at home? You know, if there's a really sharp difference there, then what are you really getting in return for masking or minimizing part of yourself? What's the payoff? Because being your real self sounds lovely in theory, but there can be really powerful reasons for holding that back. And that calculation can be really quite practical, even wrenching, because, you know, some people will stay closeted in a workplace that's hostile to queer identities. There may be also times when expressing your authentic feelings may risk harmful consequences. Women have often been disproportionately penalized for displaying negative emotions. You know, the Black Lives Matter things brought to the fore how people are dealing with institutional racism. So we're not talking about moments of prudent self-censorship, which sometimes really can't be avoided. But we are talking about when people are living a different life, burdened by stereotypes, and using inauthenticity as a strategy, as a way of navigating the workplace. And if that's how you operate, you're dealing with a serious authenticity wobble. And while withholding your true self may sometimes help you solve problems in the short term, it puts a really artificial cap on trust, and by extension, your ability to lead. And when people sense that you're concealing the truth or being less than authentic, they are far less willing to make themselves vulnerable to you in the way that leadership demands. So inauthenticity has a cost in the performance of diverse teams. You know, diversity can be seen as a tremendous asset, but the companies that get it right have really powerful tailwinds. But, you know, this advantage isn't automatic. Simply populating your team with diverse people and experiences isn't always going to translate into better performance straight away. In fact, the uncomfortable truth is that diverse teams can underperform homogeneous teams if they're not managed actively for the differences amongst the members. And that's due to a phenomenon called the common information effect, which works like this. So as human beings, diversity doesn't automatically confer advantages in decision making. In fact, diverse teams aren't managed directly for inclusion. They can underperform homogeneous ones. That's because the shared knowledge is key in decision making, and diverse teams by definition start out with less of it. But if you create conditions of trust that allow diverse team members to bring their unique perspectives and experiences to the table, you can expand the amount of knowledge in total that your team can access and therefore create unbeatable advantage. So the expansion of knowledge and its obvious benefits rely on the real courage of authenticity wobblers. Sharing who we are can be really difficult, but it's sometimes a little bit too much to ask. But if we can regularly give in to the pressure to hold back our unique selves, then we can suppress the most valuable parts of ourselves. Not only do we end up concealing the very thing that the world needs from us, which is our differences, but we also make it harder for people to trust us. So here's the reason to care. Even if you don't see yourself as different, all of us pay the price of inauthentic interactions. All of us have a better chance of thriving in inclusive environments where authenticity can flourish. Gender bias, in other words, is not a women's problem. Systemic racism is not just an African or Asian problem. It's our shared moral and organizational imperative to create workplaces where the burdens of being different are shouldered by everybody there, because we will all obviously benefit wildly from eliminating them. So creating spaces where authenticity can thrive is not as hard as it seems. An urgent, achievable goal that requires far less audacity than disrupting industries or growing complex organizations, the things that leaders do all the time. If all of us simply take responsibility for creating companies where the differences can thrive, then all of us can show up in them authentically, and our chances of achieving true inclusion and building high levels of trust and therefore performance are pretty good. So paying less attention to what you think people want to hear and more attention to what you need to say to them, revealing your full humility to the world, your full humanity to the world, regardless of what your critics say. And while you're at it, take exquisite care of people who are different from you, confident in the knowledge that their difference is the thing that could unleash the potential and obviously our own organization's potential as well. However, the foundation of empowerment leadership is getting other people to trust you. That's certainly true, but there's one thing you need to know. The path to empowerment leadership doesn't begin when other people start to trust you. It's when you begin to trust yourself. Because to be a truly empowering leader, you need to take stock of where you wobble, not only in your relationship with others, but with yourself. Are you being honest with yourself about your ambitions? Are you ignoring what actually excites and inspires you? Are you hiding something from yourself? You might have an authenticity problem you need to address with yourself. Do you acknowledge your own needs and attend properly to them? You might need to be a bit more empathetic with yourself. Do you lack conviction in your own ideas and your ability to form? Then you've got some logic issues. So doing this work is really, really important as any leader, particularly if you are leading people or even as a salesperson or just managing yourself in your own business. If you don't trust yourself, how can anybody else trust you? So this is where I leave the article. Suffice to say that there's a number of actions that Frey and Morris recommended for Uber to take to regain trust and to train and equip their leaders as a key driving action to do this. But unsurprisingly, most of the recommendations were about the statement of values, the affirmation of the values throughout the companies, followed by training and equipping people to lead. But there's always a danger when companies hire only for technical competence and then put those people in positions of leadership without guidance, that things are going to go wrong and they will lose one of these. Acknowledging those wobbles or areas of weakness are key to our ability to build trust. So in the military, they try and get these wobbles exposed as quickly as possible. And that's why leadership courses in the military tend to include things like sleep deprivation, cold and wet, misery, because those are the things in a homogeneous team that very, very quickly expose the real wobbles that people have. If you look at the picture there, if you try live like that for 3 weeks, I promise you there will be a lot of wobbling, mostly of lower lips. But there is a purpose. It addresses inauthenticity. Logic and empathy issues quickly come out. And that builds deep trust very, very quickly. And that's what they do. So being in a group where you have trust, a bit of vulnerability, makes us able to build those relationships. If you contrast that with your standard networking behavior, where you're doing exactly the opposite, where you're broadcasting competence, where you're showing everybody how good you are, how amazing product is, and how well your business is thriving all the time. Just think of a mastermind group where everyone's telling each other what they're worried about, where their problems are. You'll find that type of group builds trust and therefore mutual support much quicker. So the act of making yourself vulnerable reveals that the consequence is less than you probably imagined. And as the fear goes, so does the worry that we don't know enough, the logic, the need to cover that up, the authenticity, and the obsession with ourselves and how we appear that stops us from seeing the other person's problem, the empathy. And those are the things that allow us to lead, sell, and be successful in our businesses. And that's all I've got for you. So I hope you were able to keep up with that. I know it's pretty fast and furious.
Perfect. Thanks, Jason, for a really interesting talk there. Does anyone have any questions? There isn't any in the chat box. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to read out our forthcoming webinars, and in that time, if anyone does have a question, please pop it in the chat. So next week, the Chamber are hosting a number of webinars. So we have our Grow Forum on Tuesday, 10 till 11. On Thursday, we have Planning Finances Based on Economic Impact. That's 9 till 10. Then, just because Claire is in the group today, we've teamed up with Claire to do a webinar on brand audit for the new environment. So that's Wednesday, the 25th, 12 till 1. And then lastly, we've got our lunchtime networking on Wednesday, the 11th of November. That one's looking quite full already. So if you did want to come to that, I would advise booking on now. We've probably got 5 spaces left on that. So I will send a link after this. And just one last plea from us. The Chamber have launched an employment survey to benchmark responses for COVID-19 against other businesses. It's the deadline tomorrow, and we really need your responses. So I will send a link after in the follow-up email, but that is my plea from today. Please go and fill that in for us. That would be a massive help. There isn't any questions in the chat box, I don't think, unless I've missed them. No, just some really nice comments for you there, Jason, which is good. Everyone's found it really interesting. So thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. Other than that, I hope you all have a lovely afternoon. Thanks for joining, and hopefully see you at another webinar soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.
I always think there should be a kind of bubbly pop sound when people go.
Yeah, that would be ideal, wouldn't it? Or some nice music until everyone leaves.
Anyway,
Hi guys, Jason, are you still on?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
It's
Thank
all
you.
right. Before Yasmin finishes off, I was frantically typing and I couldn't quite get there. I hope you don't mind, Yasmin. If just very quickly,
Yeah.
first of all,
You guys go. I'm going to go and pop the kettle on, but you guys talk away. No
it's
problem.
just a quickie, Jason. First of all, thanks. That was an excellent and informative talk. I think the bit that I was intrigued with as well was the logic, the side of logic. And whilst you'd always want to manage risk and mitigate against it, who wouldn't? I'm just wondering how that then balances against where it's right and proper not to stifle creativity and innovation.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's right and proper